it's Anna from Bright Lane Gardens, and today we are potting up some of our bare root asparagus crowns. Asparagus is one of those plants that I love to grow because it's one of the few edible perennials that you can actually harvest early in the spring. In Michigan, our asparagus harvesting season is usually late April through mid-June, which is way earlier than any other crops that we grow up here. Asparagus also happens to be one of those plants that I call a love it and leave it plant, meaning once you have this guy successfully established in the ground, there's very little care and maintenance that you need to do to ensure an annual harvest every single year. So today we're going to talk about how we can successfully establish these guys in the ground. That means we're going to talk about the best soil, where to plant, how and when to fertilize, and what water needs they have. Let's head on over to my potting wagon so we can take a closer look at what these asparagus crowns need to succeed. So I'm holding a bundle of asparagus crowns here, and these are each about small to medium size, around a year old. Now, asparagus can grow for up to 40 years. This is a long-lived perennial that can produce for many, many years as long as it's well established and in a sunny location with fertile, well-draining soil. So these guys here have the potential to live until 2060, which is so insane to think about a plant like this living for the next 40 years. If you've been following our channel at all, then you already know that I am a huge fan of container gardening. I think container gardening opens up opportunities to people with all different size land and lots so that they can grow what they want to grow in pots on their patios. Asparagus is actually one of those plants that I don't recommend planting in containers. They'll usually do just fine for the first couple of years and will even shoot up some healthy asparagus shoots in that time. But long term, you really want this plant to be able to spread out wide and far and produce a ton of asparagus spears for you. Every single year, this root mass gets larger and larger, and it will continue to grow in a linear fashion, so you'll actually get more and more spears every single year, which is a huge advantage to growing an established asparagus plant. Growing these guys in a container limits their ability to produce, and they don't really like that quality of soil. They would much rather have a large open space with fertile, well-draining soil. Therefore, I do recommend that ultimately you plant your asparagus in the ground. Now, today, since we're a plant nursery, we are going to be potting up these bare root crowns into 2-gallon containers, which is about this size, which will give the root enough space to spread out, and he could even live in here for a year or two. But anything beyond that, we definitely want to make sure we're getting this guy in the ground. Now, of course, we want to sell healthy, robust asparagus plants to our customers, so I am going to use a soil mix that I would recommend you're amending your ground soil with as well. For an asparagus growth cycle, they are really storing a ton of energy in that crown underground, and that's what enables them to shoot up those fresh asparagus spears first thing in the spring, despite having just come out of dormancy. Knowing that, we want to make sure that when we're planting our asparagus, we're amending the soil with a really fertile mixture that contains either manure or compost or worm castings. So in the soil blend I'm using today, I'm going to be amending it with worm castings for those additional nutrients. Now, the advantage of this is I don't have to fertilize right off the bat. Since that growth cycle is a spring producing growth cycle, I'm going to just make sure that I'm top dressing with compost or worm castings, whatever my nutrient balance is, and I'm actually not going to fertilize until close to fall, after my plant is done producing asparagus spears. In this wagon in front of me, I have my classic soil blend that I hand mix myself, and we use as a base foundation for all of our plants here at Bright Lane Gardens. Essentially, this mix is a really nice blend of garden soil, coco coir, and a little bit of perlite and sand to encourage good drainage. I use this as a base for just about all of my plants here, and then I amend the soil beyond that base for the particular needs of that plant. In this case, we're going to be amending the soil today with a blend of these wiggle worm castings. If you haven't used worm castings in the past, worm castings are a great alternative to compost in some circumstances. They tend to be a lot more rich than some of your organic compost. I like using worm castings because they are so rich, so I use a lower percentage of worm castings to soil than I would with compost. Typically, if I was using an organic compost, I would do a 50-50 mix with my soil blend, but because I'm using these worm castings, I'm going to do a 25%, 75% mix, with 25% of that being the worm castings. So worm castings are a really nice option to use. They are a little more expensive for each bag, and that does tend to surprise some people. But when you do see a bag of worm castings, just think to yourself, a bag of worm castings will go further than the same size bag of compost would. So today I'm going to amend the soil with 25% of these worm castings here. Another benefit of worm castings is they're really nice and loose. And they also don't carry any odor with them as some composts and fertilizers can. So as you can see, it just looks like a really dark, rich soil, and it blends in really nicely with any of my soil blends. So in my container here, I want a 75% mix of my soil blend and 25% of my wiggle worm castings. At the very bottom, I'm actually going to start with my soil mix only because there's a couple larger pieces that will prevent it from spilling out the bottom of these holes here. Now that I've got a few inches of soil in the very bottom there, I'm going to take a couple handfuls of my wiggle worm castings, and I just want to blend that in as much as I can. When you're planting asparagus crowns, you're actually going to plant just about all of it beneath the soil. I just want a really thin layer of soil over the very top of this crown here, because that's where my spears are going to come out. And you can actually see some little itty bitty babies just starting to sprout up out of the top there. Now, when you're planting asparagus crowns, they don't want to be planted completely vertically. They actually want the roots to be spread out a little bit, almost as if over a mound. So when you're potting it up in your container, you're actually going to create a little mound of dirt right there in the middle that your crown is going to spread over the top of. And this is going to help those roots spread out nice and even as soon as that warm weather hits in the spring. So coming back to my container here, I'm going to use my soil mix and create a nice little mound in the middle that's about the same height as the asparagus crown that I picked out. Definitely incorporate a little bit of your worm castings or compost on top of that. And you don't need to be packing anything down firmly by any means. Anytime you're potting up plants, you definitely don't want to pack it down firmly, as that can prevent oxygen and water from reaching the roots. So I have my little mound created there in the middle, and now I'm going to take my asparagus crown here and let those roots droop right over that mound. I kind of like to tuck them down into the sides here too. But as you can see, there's a really nice spread around those roots, so they have a really good opportunity to grow smaller roots in between and create a nice network that will continue to spread out once this plant is planted in the ground. From here, we're going to go ahead and fill in the sides. Since we're doing a 25-75% blend, I'm usually just doing 3 handfuls of my soil mix for every 1 handful of my wiggle worm castings. And I always like to top dress with either my compost or wiggle worm castings, because every time you water this plant, the nutrients will gradually leach down into the soil, feeding that plant. And as you can see, the top of that crown is just barely sticking up out of the soil surface. Everything else is completely covered, making sure that the root mass is going to stay nice and moist. So you'll follow that same strategy for planting these crowns directly in the ground outside as well. If you are transplanting a container grown asparagus into the ground, you just want to make sure you're taking the time to really loosen up those roots It's okay if you break some of the smaller roots, they will regenerate and grow back, but definitely make sure you're breaking up some of that soil, make those roots nice and loose so that they have the best opportunity to spread out as much as possible during this summer season. This is actually an example of an asparagus plant that I dug up earlier this spring that I'm going to transplant into another location this year. But this guy I planted as a small 1-year crown just 3 years ago, and as you can see, he's already grown exponentially. You can see down here the little asparagus shoots that are starting to come up down there. I've had this guy out of the ground for several weeks and he's still sending up those shoots just like nothing ever happened, which is amazing. So I can't wait to get this guy transplanted back in the ground and see how long he can make it. The reason I'm moving him is so that I can ensure he has a larger space to grow into so I don't have to transplant him again. Another thing to note is you will notice these roots have grown pretty much horizontally. This is how this plant likes to spread. So the depth isn't nearly as important as the width of the area that you have to plant in. Keep in mind this guy started as just a little itty bitty 1-year crown, and look at how much that root mass has spread out in just a few years. So imagine how much space the single plant will need in a decade. You might notice that I didn't mention anything about fertilizing these crowns when you're planting them. Just like any somewhat dormant plant, asparagus does not need to be fertilized early in the season. Because of the growth cycle of this spring producing plant, it already has all the energy that it needs stored up in this root mass to produce those asparagus spears in the spring. Therefore, a top dressing of compost or worm castings or composted manure will do just fine in giving this root mass the nutrients that it needs to continue to produce those spears. Once your asparagus spear production is complete for the year, so for us up here in northern Michigan, that's usually around mid-June, that's when I'm going to start fertilizing this plant. Usually I aim to get 2 applications of fertilizer in after the spears are done producing. So I'll do 1 application towards the end of June and a final application right before we start to get that cooler fall weather towards the end of August. And that will be plenty of nutrients for this plant to thrive. The best part about asparagus is if you don't fertilize in your normal routine, your plant will do just fine. The only reason that I fertilize is I hope to get just a few more spears that following spring. If you are going to fertilize your asparagus, there's a wide variety of fertilizers that will do just fine. Typically a well-balanced fertilizer like a 10-10-10 or a 12-12-12 will do great. I like to use my Garden Tone fertilizer here. This is an organic granular fertilizer that's sold by Espomo Organics. You've probably seen it in some of our other videos if you've watched us before. We love Espomo Organics and we really love their fertilizer line. I'm not a huge fan of fertilizers personally, but I like how gentle a lot of these formulations are. I've never had any issues with burning my plants at all, and granular is just the way to go if you're looking for a long-term feeding solution. A granular fertilizer really just looks like small pieces of gravel. This is kind of the texture of it. And when you do fertilize, you're just going to sprinkle this around the crown of the plant. Typically, if there's foliage on top of the plant, you would look for what we call the rain canopy. So if it were to rain outside, then wherever that line of rain would roll off the plant is where you'd want to place that fertilizer. The goal is that you want it to go where your water is going to go, because water is what gets this to break down into the soil, which will then feed the roots of your plants. Another great thing about using a well-balanced fertilizer like this is I can use this on any of my garden plants. I use it on my fruit plants, my veggie plants, even some of my flowers. So look for a fertilizer that you can use on multiple plants around your home, and it will likely work just fine for your asparagus plants. Blood meal is another top recommended product for asparagus plants, and most balanced fertilizers like this Garden Tone fertilizer will have blood meal incorporated as a part of their product. So you shouldn't have to buy that separately unless that's the only product that you want to use. This asparagus plant that we potted up today will go to our retail sales this summer. We sell out of our asparagus every single year because it's one of those crops that's so easy to grow. and we love it up here in northern Michigan. We even have an asparagus festival close by, so we are big asparagus fans up here. But if you live in a region like we do here that has cold winters, warmer summer, and a great amount of precipitation, then asparagus is likely going to be an excellent choice for you to grow in your own backyard. Believe it or not, a lot of our asparagus customers are people that have bought asparagus from us before because they love growing it so much that they just keep wanting to add more and more to their garden. Now, after your asparagus plant is done producing spears for the year, you will start to see a very delicate looking asparagus fern shoot up, and sometimes the very tip of it can look like an asparagus spear, but it will continue to grow longer and longer, and it will thin out towards the top, so you'll know right away that it's not an asparagus spear. These are called the asparagus ferns, and this is actually a dead one from last year that I just left on the plant, but essentially it would just be a green version of this. These can grow up to 4 feet tall, and they might look like a weed, but they are not a weed. This is actually an essential part of the asparagus growth cycle. So the asparagus ferns act just like the leaves on a tree, where they get energy from the sun and turn that into energy for the root mass down below. This is what provides the energy for your asparagus roots to produce those spears first thing in the spring as soon as they come out of dormancy. So don't cut these ferns back. It's really important that you let these grow, let them grow as tall as they want to grow, keep watering that plant, keep caring for that plant, and just know that these ferns are what are giving your roots the energy to produce those delicious asparagus spears first thing in the spring. That's all I've got on my asparagus video for today. Once we start to get some nice looking asparagus spears out back, I will put together a step-by-step harvesting video because there's a couple tips and techniques that can really help benefit your plant and your yield overall. But in the meantime, I'm here to encourage you to grow asparagus this year. If you have any questions or comments on the process that I showed you today, or any questions on growing asparagus overall, please leave them in the comments section below. Our spring prep continues as the season gets a little bit closer, and we've got more videos coming up. So if you enjoy watching content like this, please take the time to like and subscribe to our channel and set up those alerts so that you know when a new video drops. We're a small brick and mortar plant nursery up in northern Michigan, and viewers like you are what keeps us going. So thank you so much for taking the time to tune in with us today. And as always, I sure hope to catch you next time. Bye-bye.